Hello, this is a video tutorial for Unit 2, Activity 1. And in Unit 2, what we're going to focus on are two things. We're going to focus on story elements. And so story elements will be things like character, plot, setting, point of view, the different parts that make up stories, and the different things we have to include when we tell stories. So that'll be our focus throughout Unit 2. And the second focus is we're going to focus on scary stories. And sometimes when we start this unit, I have some students that will tell me, I don't really like scary stories. I don't really like horror stories. And you'll see those words scary and horror a lot in this unit. But you don't have to use as examples in this unit sort of blood and guts, scary sort of horror movies. Movies like Harry Potter or stories that like Disney stories, they fit into scary stories. They have scary scenes and tension and anxious moments. And so you'll see that for scary stories, it's a very loose definition of what is a scary story. With that said, in Activity 1, we're going to focus on archetypes. So it's important that you read through and go through the content here and get an understanding of what an archetype is. But basically, an archetype is something that is repeated over and over again in storytelling. So it's a type of character or a location that is used over and over again in stories or in movies. That's what we mean by an archetype. They're going to use the movie The Matrix as an example to explain an archetypal plot pattern. So the way that the movie The Matrix works from the beginning to the ending of the movie, it follows a certain pattern, and we can watch other types of other movies or read other stories, and we can see that same pattern and those same types of events and characters being used over again. Okay. And then what they'll try to do at the bottom here of the content is they'll try to show you an example of that plot pattern in The Matrix and about how, again, certain things are happening in that movie that we should see as very familiar, that we should be able to see, oh, okay, I've seen that same type of scene and I've seen that same type of character in another movie or in another story that I've read. That's what we mean by archetypes, is the repeating of the same, again, characters, locations, or events in story after story after story. And once you feel like you have an understanding of what an archetype is, you can click on Assignment. And there's going to be two assignments in this activity. The first one is going to be called Horror Archetypes, and it's going to be a discussion. And what you're going to be asked to do is you're going to be asked to come up with 3 characters, 3 locations, and 3 plot patterns, or another word we can use is events that happen in a story, that we would say are archetypes, that we would see over and over again in scary stories. So an example of a character that you see in a lot of scary stories is a vampire. So that would be an example of an archetypal character. An example of a location or a setting that we would see in a lot of scary stories would be a haunted house. An example of a plot pattern or an event that you would see in many scary stories would be a killer chasing a teenager with a knife. If you think of like the Halloween movies, for example, right? And so what your job is to come up with 3 characters, 3 locations, and 3 plot patterns that you would see over and over again in scary stories. I think that this discussion is asking for something that's a little bit more specific and maybe a little harder to explain in the instructions than some of our other discussion assignments. So when you click on the Horror Archetypes discussion, you'll see that I have already posted an example. And this is from a previous student in this class. And these are examples that she came up with. So we have examples for character. And so we have the cheerleader, the survivor, the zombie. So those are all examples of types of characters that you would see in scary stories. So they give a type of character, an archetype, and then they give an example from a movie or from a book, right? For the locations, we have 3 examples of locations that you would see in scary stories. For example, a remote town that's sort of in the middle of nowhere. And then you'll see an example from a movie, right? So that your job is to come up with 3 characters and examples, 3 locations and examples, and then 3 plot patterns or events. So for example, you'll see scary movies often use exorcisms, right? That's been common in scary movies for 50 years, right? And then the classic example of that would be from the original Exorcist movie, right? So you want to see, again, if you can come up with scary archetypes and examples. So you should have a list of 3 characters, 3 settings, 3 plot patterns. Okay, and of course, as always with the discussions, you want to reply to 2 classmates when you're done. Okay. All right. So that's the first assignment. The second assignment is to create a scary comic strip. So once you've done assignment 1, the discussion, hopefully you have an idea of some of the archetypes that we see in scary stories, some of the locations, some of the characters, some of the plot patterns or events. And so you're going to try to turn what you've learned about archetypes into a little story. Okay? You've got here an example of some of the different terminology that comes up in comic strips. Maybe the most important one for us is panel. So a panel is the comic strip box. So a comic strip is going to have a certain number of panels, and I'm going to ask you to have 6. So you have to have 6 boxes in your comic strip. Okay. Some of the other criteria, if we go down here, you'll see the criteria for your own comic strip. You'll have to have 6 cells or panels. You'll have to have a clear beginning, middle, and end to your story. And you'll have to have 3 horror archetypes. So a character, a setting, and an event. So maybe you'll have a ghost in your story, and that'll be an archetype. Maybe you'll have a haunted house. That could be your setting archetype. And then maybe you'll have someone being possessed by a demon or something. Maybe that's your event, right? So you want to have horror or scary archetypes in your story. You want to have speech bubbles. So you want to have dialogue between the characters. You want to have characters speaking or talking out loud. And then lastly, and sometimes students forget this when they create their comic strip, you want to have a brief paragraph that explains the archetypes that you've used in your comic strip. To give you an example of this, if we skip down here, we have an example of a little comic strip. And in this, you can see you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 panels or boxes. And that's what you need to have, at least 6. And it tells a little story about 2 girls that decide to go into a sort of an abandoned, scary, haunted house, right? And so this is a little example of a scary comic strip. You can use this as kind of a guide to create your own. Try to come up with your own, maybe a little more original story, but this is a good little guide. And then you'll see down here, you'll see the paragraph explanation. So in this paragraph, it's going to explain the archetypes. For example, the haunted house that was used inside the story. So no matter how clear you think your comic strip is, and even if you think it's very easy to understand and it's very obvious what the archetypes are, you still want to give a little paragraph explanation explaining how you came up with this comic strip and the different elements that you used. Okay? So this is an example here. Now, how are you going to go about doing it? Well, a couple of ways. You can, actually more than a couple, you can do this in a lot of different ways. First off, if you want to, you can draw your own comic strip. If you want to draw it on paper and then take a picture of it or scan it and submit it that way, that's fine. Also, if you want, you can use an online comic strip program. And I use the example of Storyboard that, and you can click right here, and I can open it up. So if you want to use an online comic strip program, there are a lot out there, and Storyboard that is a good one. And so if I click on it, and by the way, you can follow these 7 steps right here, and it shows you how to create a comic strip on Storyboard that. But just to do a brief tutorial here, if I click log in, I'm already logged into my school board account, which is a Google account, and you presumably will already be logged into your My Tools to Go account, which is a Google account. So you don't have to log in. You can just click log in with Google, and you should go right in, and if not, then it'll just ask for your My Tools to Go information. And this is just a really quick little comic strip that I made. Certainly you're going to have to come up with more events and more action and more dialogue here, but I've just got some characters and some scenery, and here's an example of a speech bubble here, right? And notice it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 panels, right? So I've got the required number of panels. So what you'd do is you'd come up with something, something like this, again, hopefully with a lot more detail and action, and that tells the story from the beginning to the end. And then what you would do is you could do a couple of things to submit it. You could download it, and when you download it, what you could do is you could download it as a GIF file. You can download it as a PDF. You can download it in a number of different formats. I would recommend PDF. And so it's taking its time here, but it's downloading. Okay, so it's downloaded right here as a PDF. And when you open it, it's going to have demo on it because I'm using the free version. That's fine. I'm not going to penalize you or worry about the word demo being in your comic strip. You can submit it to me just like this. But if you prefer, you could take a picture or a screenshot of your comic strip and submit it to me that way. Or you could go print and storyboard only, and you could save it. Pardon me. You could print it and then scan it and send it to me that way, or you could save it as a PDF and just save the PDF. And in this case, it's saving to my. I can save it to my my desktop. And then I've got it saved as a PDF on my desktop, and I can submit that. So that's another way to submit it. So that's one way you can go about creating a comic strip, is you can do it on an online comic strip program like Storyboard that. Again, if I wanted to start my comic strip, I could just go create a storyboard up here. And it's always going to start with 3 panels. But I can go add more panels, and I can add 3 more, and then I have my 6 panels, and I can start filling them in with scenes, characters, shapes. I can search if I want to find anything here. So say I want to find a school setting. I could find different school pictures and use them in my comic strip. There is a video here called Getting Started with Storyboard that, if you want to take a look at it as well too. I have some students that jump on Storyboard that and pick this up really quickly and make a comic strip real easily. That's great. Some students have to play around with this and it takes them a little while. Some students don't really like using the online program and they'd rather just draw the comic strip on their own, or use another comic strip maker, or try to use PowerPoint or Google Docs or Microsoft Word and create their comic strip in their own way. You are free to do the comic strip any way you like, as long as you end up with a 6-paneled comic strip and a paragraph explanation. And then again, you would, as always, submit it to the Dropbox. I hope this helps. If you have any questions, particularly about the comic strip, please let me know.